that the court, I've said this since literally day one when President Trump announced Liberation Day. I said that day, this is illegal. The Supreme Court is going to strike this down. He does not actually have the constitutional authority to do this.
I think it's also going to be very disruptive to the economy as we get through this. I mean, let's just say, I mean, but it has been. But I'm just saying, let's
it'll be the best thing for the economy.
Well,
it'll be great.
That's what he says.
No. If tariffs are struck down.
I'm saying functionally, we have a question that we have to ask ourselves, which is what do we do with the tariffs that have been collected? Right. What do we do with the funds that have been collected?
By the way, some of them have been spent already. They're already
those are illegitimate, illegal funds that we have now collected. I mean, I'm not sure how that works.
In today's video, Bakari Sellers takes apart Ben Shapiro on news. Night with Abby Phillip, as a simple talk about Trump's economic plans suddenly turns into a sharp lesson on constitutional law when Bakari challenges Shapiro on whether Trump's tariffs were even legal. With the Supreme Court now looking at whether a president can use emergency powers to skip past Congress, Bakari points out that these tariffs aren't only weak economic policy but also break the basic rules of separation of powers. And even Shapiro starts to stumble once the real facts hit the table. So let's get into it and see how Bakari Sellers shuts down Ben Shapiro on Newsnight with Abby Phillip.
There are very pointed questions, but we can just start with Chief Justice Roberts. Why not? He's the Chief Justice. As he mentioned, generally, the Congress has the power to tax, and that's a power that's reserved only for them. Trump's lawyers or the administration lawyers are saying that this isn't a tax. What they're doing is essentially regulating imports. This is more about foreign policy, and what they're doing is trying to bring manufacturing jobs back to the United States. So they're regulating import to allow that to happen, and that any taxes that comes from that is incidental. The lawyers on the other side are saying that's BS. This is a tax, and only the Congress has the right to do that. Now, it is of note that Justice Alito did bring up that in emergency situations, the president does have more power. And we're going to hear this question answered of, Trump has this notion now that he can decide when it's an emergency. And he's tried to use that with immigration. He's tried to use that with tariffs. I think we're going to get an answer as to whether or not a president can unilaterally decide when it's an emergency, so he should get more power.
Ben, the president has won something like more than 20 cases that have come up to the Supreme Court. Do you see this as a time, after sort of hearing some of the questions that are being asked, where the idea of more presidential power for this president in this case won't fly?
Well, I mean, I think that one of the characterizations of the court that I always find suspect is when people say, even the conservatives on the court are saying this. Okay, the conservatives on the court tend to be textualists, which means that they're actually looking at the text of the Constitution as opposed to sort of a vague peripheral understanding of what the Constitution means. And so when you're looking at the textualists, and they are saying the president does not actually have emergency authority to simply impose tariffs on the basis of trade deficits, which is essentially what he's been doing, that is a very conservative position. I've been critical of the president, very critical of the president on his tariff policies themselves, which I think are actually economically wrong and I think are actually damaging to the country in a lot of ways on foreign policy, actually. But that's not what's at issue. The issue here is whether the president has the emergency authority to do this sort of stuff. And I thought that the best question that was asked came from Justice Gorsuch, in which he actually said to the lawyers for the president, if, let's say, the next president decides that on the basis of emergency authority, that climate change is an emergency, and therefore he's going to slap, or she is going to slap a 50% tariff on all automobiles coming into the country, would that president have the authority to do this? And the attorney for the president, President Trump, said yes, they would have the authority to do this. I do not believe that the court, I've said this since literally day one when President Trump announced Liberation Day. I said that day, this is illegal. The Supreme Court is going to strike this down. He does not actually have the constitutional authority to do this.
I think it's also going to be very disruptive to the economy as we get through this. I mean, let's just say, I mean, but it has been. But I'm just saying,
it'll be the best thing for the economy.
Well,
it'll be great.
That's what he says.
No. If tariffs are struck down.
But I'm saying functionally, we have a question that we have to ask ourselves, which is what do we do with the tariffs that have been collected? Right. What do we do with the funds that have been collected?
By the way, some of them have been spent already. They're already
those are illegitimate, illegal funds that we have now collected. I mean, I'm not sure how that works.
Dante Mills, Bakari Sellers, and Ben Shapiro dive into one of the biggest constitutional debates of our generation as they break down how far a president's emergency powers should actually reach. And honestly, Dante and Bakari are standing on solid ground because the Constitution makes it clear that only Congress has the authority to create taxes and set tariffs, and Article 1, Section 8 leaves no room for confusion. What Trump tried to do by calling his tariffs regulatory instead of taxes is a textbook example of a president pushing past his limits while disguising it as economic toughness. History supports Dante and Bakari, too, since the Supreme Court has repeatedly pushed back on presidents who stretch emergency powers too far. From Truman's failed attempt to control the steel industry in 1952 to modern rulings blocking expanded executive control over immigration and federal spending. The idea that a president can simply call something an emergency to avoid Congress sets a dangerous chain reaction, because if Trump can do it for trade, then a future president could try the same trick for climate change or health care. And Justice Gorsuch raised that point for a reason, because it shows how easy that slope becomes. Economically, the tariffs were already weighing down Americans long before this case reached the court, with research from the Federal Reserve and the Peterson Institute showing that the tariffs raised prices, hurt farmers, and did nothing to bring back the manufacturing jobs that were promised. Dante and Bakari know this fight goes beyond trade because letting any president twist the meaning of emergency to grow their own power breaks the system of checks and balances that holds American democracy together.
But I don't think the Supreme Court should be concerned about that. That's a political issue. I think
that's
legally the court has to decide if there's legislation that gives the authority to the president. If it is, he can do it. If not, they can't look at the consequences of it or what the outcome is. They have to decide, is that power baked in, yes or no?
But the consequences will still be there. And I'm just saying that if we have a government right now that is highly inefficient, that is not working, that is going to be a political question that somebody is going to have to be a grown-up in the room and have to answer to figure that out.
One of the things that will be fascinating is if the court does strike it down, watch the stock market absolutely explode. Seriously, you'll watch the S&P 500 jump like nobody's business, and the president is then going to be in the awkward position of having to explain why the markets are boosted by the rejection of his key policies.
The best example of that is going to be our American automakers. I mean, you're going to see their stock just explode. You're going to see those people who are doing that type of work, for example, who are building cars from Canada, the United States, and Mexico working together, their stock, to your point, their stock's going to go through the roof.
Well, let me let everybody hear what we heard from Justice Amy Coney Barrett on this issue of if they decide that this is not legal for the president to impose these tariffs, what happens next? Here's what she said.
If you win, tell me how the reimbursement process would work. Would it be a complete mess?
It's a very complicated thing. There's got to be an administrative protest. There was a harbor management case earlier that this court was involved with in the United States Shoe, in which, the refund process took a long time. There were any number of claims and equitable relief.
So a mess.
So it's difficult,
okay.
Absolutely. We don't deny that it's difficult.
Is there a possibility, this is to you or anyone at this table, is there a possibility that the court looks at this and says, we don't want this mess, so we're just going to rule a certain way?
No.
Or will they really
I can't imagine that happens, and I really hope it doesn't happen, because I think setting a precedent like this is actually dangerous. We're supposed to have co-equal branches of government. Obviously, Congress throughout the years has ceded a lot of power to the executive branch, but using emergency powers to essentially make policy in the executive branch is wrong.
This part shows just how shaky the balance of power between Congress and the president has become, and Dante Mills and Bakari Sellers are completely justified in sounding the alarm, because this fight is not only about tariffs or trade, but about whether presidents can keep stretching emergency powers until Congress is reduced to a spectator. History shows that whenever a president bypasses Congress in the name of an emergency, it leads to executive overreach and disorder. And you can see it in examples like Franklin Roosevelt's sweeping banking powers in 1933, or Truman's failed effort to take control of the steel industry in 1952, which the Supreme Court blocked for the very same reasons being argued right now, because presidential authority has limits. Ben Shapiro tries to say the courts should ignore political fallout, but that avoids the real point, since the courts are supposed to uphold the Constitution, not shield presidents from the consequences of actions taken without legal grounding. If Trump's tariffs were collected without proper approval, then that money is indeed unlawful, and calling it a political issue avoids the real harm done to families and businesses. Bakari's point about the markets reacting positively if the tariffs are struck down also fits, because during Trump's trade war, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and the American Farm Bureau warned that the policies were creating long-term uncertainty. And economists showed that American households were paying more each year due to higher prices caused by the tariffs. Ending them wouldn't only be a political moment, it would bring economic relief. And Dante and Bakari's position is rooted in both sound economic research and the core principles of the Constitution.
And on top of that, I understand that it is going to be a mess. I mean, think about the farmers. The farmers have been hurt quite a bit as a result of these tariffs. And it's going to cause long-term damage to these farmers. But in the meantime, the Trump administration has decided to use some of the revenue from these tariffs to help make these farmers whole. So to your point, yes, a lot of that money has already been spent already. I don't know how the refunds are going to work. I don't really care. What I care more about
one
is
of the points that was made by a justice is, if this power is given, how do we get it back? Right. You can't get it back. So they're not going to give this power because it's difficult to figure out. Because once it's out there, there's no president that's going to relinquish that power.
It's almost as if bad and intrusive government policy that affects huge numbers of people turns into a mess, actually, as just a general rule.
Have you advised Trump on any of this?
I've been saying this clearly and openly since before Liberation.
He's not listening.
Interestingly, it's a fascinating conversation about the expansion of the administrative state, which we talked about kind of on a microcosm level here in New York City when it comes to affordability. It's
always back to Mondani.
No, not necessarily, but there is an appropriate conversation for us to be having about affordability.
It's a Birkenstock stamping on the human face forever.
Of course, there's a lot of experts going back and forth on whether tariffs are the right answer for this, but I do think it's important that we are seeing executive leadership on this when it comes to making America whole and making sure that we are not being taken advantage of on the global scale. That is important. So I'm hopeful that that conversation continues beyond this particular case. I know the Trump administration is very, very passionate about this. And frankly, heck, from a fiscal conservative perspective, if tariffs could replace, I don't know, the federal income tax someday, I would be cheering for that from the rooftops.
Good.
When I was in the legislature, an old state legislator once told me, we were having a discussion about fees and taxes, and he said they're both three-letter words that take money out of your pocket. I mean, you can add tariff to that as well, because tariff is simply just a tax.
But there's other ways to regulate imports, and I think that was part of the conversation today.
Section 202 authority.
If that's what you want to do, President, you have the right to do that without imposing a tax.
Correct.
And the tariff here is a tax.
Anna Kasparian and Dante Mills are absolutely on the right side of this debate because they are focused on constitutional limits and real economic impact instead of empty political slogans. While Isabel Brown tries to frame unchecked executive action as a sign of strong leadership, but completely overlooks how dangerous that mindset can be. History proves that once a president gets broad emergency powers, those powers rarely shrink. And the Patriot Act is a perfect example since it was sold as temporary but ended up expanding government surveillance for years. The same risk exists here because if the court accepts Trump's argument, future presidents could use the same reasoning for anything from climate rules to changing domestic trade policy. And Isabel's suggestion that tariffs could replace income taxes is simply unrealistic because research from the Tax Foundation and Brookings shows that tariffs work like regressive taxes that hit low and middle income, Americans hardest by raising the cost of basic goods. During Trump's trade war with China, the Federal Reserve found that American consumers ended up paying nearly all of the tariff costs. Not foreign companies, and that is not conservative fiscal policy but weak economics dressed up as national pride. Anna and Dante are right to stress that these so-called emergency tariffs hurt farmers, manufacturers, and working families far more than they help. And even Trump's bailout money for farmers was just a patch on a crisis he created himself. The Constitution gives Congress the power to tax for a reason because it creates accountability. And once a president starts creating their own tax system under the label of emergency authority, democracy gets pushed aside in favor of executive convenience.